Professor Vexstar stood at the front of the Galactic University's survival skills classroom, his forearms gesticulating wildly as he addressed his mixed-species class. His skin had that particular shade of purple that suggested he was either very excited or had been eating too much fermented plankton again. Given his reputation, it was probably both. "Today, my dear students, we embark on the most challenging field exercise of the semester," he announced, his voice carrying that tone professors use when they're about to ruin your entire week. "We shall be visiting the barren moon of Corvash 7, where each of you will demonstrate your species' natural survival capabilities." Jake Morrison, the only human in the class and arguably the only one who looked like he wasn't about to have a panic attack, leaned back in his chair with a grin that would have made a shark nervous. While his classmates frantically took notes on their various electronic devices, Jake was doodling what appeared to be a blueprint of some kind on actual paper, with an actual pencil, like some kind of primitive savage. Zip, a nervous little creature that resembled a cross between a ferret and a disco ball, raised one of his 6 hands. "Professor, what about environmental suits? Atmospheric processors? Basic construction nanobots?" "Ah, excellent question, Zip," Vexstar replied, clearly pleased with himself. "Each species will be restricted to methods and materials that would be considered natural to your evolutionary development. No advanced technology permitted." Corrind, a massive reptilian student, whose scales seemed to shimmer with superiority complex, let out what could charitably be called a laugh. "This should be interesting. What's the primitive human going to do, rub 2 sticks together?" Jake's grin widened. "Something like that." Professor Vexstar's eyes gleamed with what he probably thought was academic curiosity but looked more like sadistic glee. "Indeed, Morrison. While Corrind will demonstrate his species' natural ability to burrow protective caves using their reinforced claws, and Zip will showcase the traditional nest-weaving techniques of his people, you will be limited to whatever crude methods your species developed during your brief evolutionary period." "Brief?" Jake raised an eyebrow. "Professor, how long do you think humans have been building shelters?" "Oh, a few thousand years at most, I imagine. Your species only recently discovered fire after all." The silence in the classroom was deafening. Jake's pencil stopped moving. Even Zip, who was usually too anxious to pay attention to anything, looked up from his notes with what might have been concern. "Recently discovered fire," Jake repeated slowly. "Well, yes, compared to species like Corrind's people, who have been constructing subterranean cities for over 50,000 years, your primitive firemaking is quite quaint." Jake set down his pencil and leaned forward. "Professor, just to be clear, when you say natural materials only, you mean anything I can find on the moon's surface, right? No restrictions on what I can do with those materials." "Precisely, though I doubt you'll be able to accomplish much with mere stones and whatever scrub vegetation exists on Corvash 7. And the grading criteria? Structural integrity, weather resistance and livability. A simple pass-fail evaluation." Jake's smile was now approaching dangerous levels of smugness. "Perfect. When do we leave?" As the class filed out, chattering nervously about the upcoming assignment, Zip scurried up to Jake. "Aren't you worried? I mean, the rest of us have natural advantages. Corrind has those claws, I have my species' instinctive weaving abilities, and the others all have their own specialized traits. What do humans have?" Jake gathered his things, including what appeared to be a hand-drawn manual titled, "Primitive Survival Techniques for Dummies." The cover featured a stick figure building what looked suspiciously like a log cabin. "Oh, don't worry about me, Zip," Jake said, patting the anxious alien on one of his furry shoulders. "Humans have been surviving on hostile worlds for a very long time. We've picked up a few tricks along the way." As Jake walked out of the classroom, Professor Vexstar was already mentally composing his research paper about the inevitable failure of human primitive survival instincts. This was going to be educational indeed. What the good professor didn't know was that Jake had spent his summers working with his grandfather, a man who could build a functioning cabin using nothing but an axe, a bad attitude, and what he called good old-fashioned human stubborn. This was going to be fun. The transport shuttle touched down on Corvash 7 with all the grace of a drunk elephant, which was pretty much standard for Galactic University's budget fleet. Jake stepped out onto the moon's surface and took a deep breath of the recycled air from his environmental suit. The landscape before him looked like what would happen if Mars had a baby with a particularly depressing parking lot. "Behold, students," Professor Vexstar announced through the comm system, his voice crackling with static and academic superiority. "The challenging environment of Corvash 7, barren, hostile, and completely lacking in the conveniences of modern civilization." Jake surveyed the terrain with the eye of someone who'd been dragged on enough camping trips to know opportunity when he saw it. Rocky outcroppings dotted the landscape, there was a decent stand of what looked like hardy shrubs near a dry riverbed, and those weren't just random boulders scattered around, those were deposits of different mineral types. His grandfather would have called this place a fixer-upper with potential. Now then, Vexter continued, consulting his tablet with the enthusiasm of someone about to watch a particularly entertaining disaster, you have exactly 18 standard hours to construct your shelters. Corrand, you may begin your excavation immediately. The massive reptilian student cracked his knuckles, which sounded like breaking concrete, and proceeded to attack the ground with claws that could probably cut through starship hull plating. Chunks of rock and dirt flew everywhere, as he began carving out what would presumably become an underground bunker. Zip, meanwhile, was frantically gathering every piece of fibrous material he could find, his 6 arms moving in a blur as his species' nest-building instincts kicked in. The other students activated various biological abilities, from hardened carapaces to prehensile appendages, each one perfectly adapted for their particular survival strategy. Jake stood perfectly still, hands on his hips, looking for all the world like a tourist trying to decide which overpriced restaurant to visit. Morrison, Professor Vexter called out, his tone dripping with false concern, perhaps you should begin your, primitive shelter construction. Time is, as they say, ticking. Just getting my bearings, Professor, Jake replied cheerfully. Quick question about the rules. When you say structural integrity, what exactly are we talking about? Are we grading on basic weather resistance, or are we looking for something that could withstand, say, seismic activity? Vexter blinked all 4 of his eyes in sequence, a nervous habit he'd developed after too many years of dealing with overconfident students. Well, basic weather resistance should be sufficient for a passing grade. I hardly think you need to concern yourself with advanced engineering principles. Right. And when you say livability, we're talking about basic shelter from the elements, or are we including factors like thermal regulation, air circulation, maybe some basic amenities? Morrison, you're overthinking this. A simple lean-to would be adequate for your species' primitive needs. Jake nodded sagely. Lean-to. Got it. And just to confirm, anything I can physically manipulate or reshape from natural materials is fair game. No restrictions on techniques or methods. Correct. Though I fail to see how your species' limited tool-making abilities could possibly. Perfect. Thanks, Professor. Jake finally moved, and his first action was to walk over to one of the rocky outcroppings and give it a solid kick. The rock cracked along what appeared to be a natural fault line, splitting into several pieces that looked suspiciously like they'd been precision cut for specific purposes. Corrand paused in his excavation to sneer. What's the matter, human? Can't even find a proper digging implement. Oh, I'm not digging, Jake said, examining the broken rock pieces with the air of someone selecting the perfect tool from a well-organized workshop. Digging is for species that evolved underground. Humans evolved to build up. He selected a piece of stone that had fractured into a sharp wedge-shaped tool and gave it a few experimental swings. The balance was perfect. His grandfather would have been proud. Build up. Zip called out nervously from his rapidly growing pile of nest material. What does that mean? Jake's grin was now approaching levels that should probably be regulated by galactic law. Oh, you'll see, Professor. What's the local gravity here compared to Earth's standard? Approximately 0.7 Earth gravity. Why? Just wondering how much weight this moon can support. For structural calculations, you understand. Professor Vexter made a note on his tablet, probably something about human delusions of grandeur. This was going to be even more entertaining than he'd hoped. The primitive human was clearly out of his depth, asking about structural engineering like he actually knew what he was doing. What Professor Vexter didn't know was that Jake had just identified limestone deposits, hardwood-equivalent vegetation, a natural water source, and the perfect building site with southern exposure for maximum thermal efficiency. Time to get to work. What happened next would later be referred to in Galactic University folklore as the incident that made Professor Vexter question everything he thought he knew about primitive species. Jake started by walking through the area in what appeared to be a casual stroll, occasionally stopping to examine plants, tap rocks, or peer at the ground with the intense focus of someone reading a particularly interesting book. To the casual observer, he looked like a tourist who'd gotten lost on his way to the gift shop. To anyone who actually knew what they were looking at, Jake was conducting a comprehensive geological and botanical survey of the entire area. Interesting, he murmured, crouching down next to what looked like a completely ordinary shrub. Hardwood fiber structure, high tensile strength, naturally occurring joints every 18 inches. He broke off a branch with a sharp crack. Perfect. Professor Vexter looked up from his tablet. Morrison, I hardly think random plant collection constitutes meaningful shelter construction. Oh, I'm not collecting randomly, Professor. See, this particular species has a cellular structure that's remarkably similar to what humans call oak. Dense, strong, naturally resistant to moisture and temperature fluctuations. The kind of thing you'd want if you were planning to build something that needed to last. Jake moved to another cluster of vegetation, this time selecting longer, straighter pieces with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent years learning to identify quality building materials. And these beauties have the tensile strength of steel cable but with the flexibility to handle thermal expansion. Nature's own rebar, you might say. Zip paused in his frantic weaving to stare. How do you know all that just by looking at them? Pattern recognition, Jake said. Now sorting his gathered materials into neat piles organized by size, strength, and apparent function. Humans have been working with natural materials for about 200,000 years. You tend to pick up a few tricks. 200,000, Professor Vexitar's voice climbed an octave. That can't be right. Your species only recently achieved spaceflight. Recently is relative, Professor. We've been building shelters since before your species invented writing. Jake had moved on to the rock deposits and was now systematically testing different stones by striking them together. The sounds ranged from dull thuds to sharp ringing impacts that suggested serious tool-making potential. Corand, who had managed to excavate about 3 feet of burrow in the time Jake had been wandering around, stopped digging to watch the human work. What are you doing with those rocks? Making tools, Jake replied, as if this were the most obvious thing in the world. He'd found a piece of flint, and was now shaping it with controlled strikes from a harder stone. Each impact was precise, deliberate, and produced exactly the result he intended. See, the trick is understanding crystalline structure and fracture patterns. You apply force at the right angle, with the right amount of pressure, and the stone breaks exactly where you want it to. Within minutes, Jake had produced what could only be described as a professional quality stone axe. The blade was sharp enough to shave with, the handle was perfectly balanced, and the binding that held it all together was so tight it looked like it had been manufactured. That's impossible, Corand said flatly. Stone tools are crude, primitive things. That looks like it was made by a machine. Nope, just about 40,000 years of accumulated human experience with knapping techniques. Jake gave the axe a few practice swings. My grandfather taught me this when I was 12, said every human should know how to make their own tools. Professor Vexitar was now watching Jake with the horrified fascination of someone watching a natural disaster unfold in real time. Morrison, surely you don't intend to cut down trees with that primitive implement. Trees? Jake looked around at the scrubby vegetation and laughed. Professor, I'm not building a tree fort. I'm building a cabin. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Zip dropping his entire collection of nesting material. A cabin, Vexitar's voice was barely a whisper. Well, log cabin technically. Nothing fancy, just a basic single-room structure with proper foundations, insulated walls, weatherproof roofing, and a functional fireplace for climate control. Jake had moved on to selecting his building materials, and was now examining potential foundation stones with the critical eye of a master craftsman. Should take about 10-12 hours to complete. Plenty of time for a decent night's sleep before inspection. Corand's jaw dropped, revealing several rows of very sharp teeth. You're insane. No one can build a cabin in 12 hours. Sure you can, if you know what you're doing and you're not wasting time on unnecessary complexity. Jake hefted his newly made axe and approached the first of his selected building materials. The key is understanding load-bearing principles, proper joint construction, and thermodynamics. Basic human engineering. Basic human engineering. Professor Vexitar was now making notes so frantically his tablet was smoking. Oh yeah. Humans have been perfecting shelter construction for millennia. We've built habitable structures in every environment on our planet, from Arctic tundra to desert wasteland to tropical rainforest. You learn to work with what you have. Jake's first swing with the stone axe bit deep into the selected plant material, producing a clean cut that would have made a steel saw jealous. His second swing was equally precise. By the third swing, it was clear that this wasn't going to be the primitive struggle everyone had expected. This was going to be a master class in applied human engineering. Professor, Zip said in a very small voice, I think we may have misunderstood something about human primitiveness. Professor Vexitar could only nod, his academic worldview beginning to crack like poorly mortared stonework. Jake, meanwhile, was already laying out his foundation stones with the precision of someone who'd built more than a few structures in his time. He was humming what sounded like an old human work song. This was going to be a very long day for everyone who wasn't human. What followed was less like watching a primitive human struggle with basic survival, and more like watching a master craftsman give a live demonstration at the Galactic Engineering Institute. Jake began with his foundation, and this was where everyone realized they were dealing with something far beyond their understanding. He didn't just stack rocks in a rough circle and call it good. He actually surveyed the ground, checking for level using a water-filled hollow reed and adjusting for drainage patterns. Each foundation stone was selected for specific properties: weight, stability, thermal mass, and weather resistance. See, the key to a good foundation is understanding load distribution, Jake explained to his increasingly horrified audience as he positioned each stone with mathematical precision. Each stone needs to bear weight evenly, while allowing for thermal expansion. Too rigid and it cracks, too flexible, and it shifts. Professor Vexter, who had abandoned all pretense of supervising other students, was now following Jake around like a particularly confused puppy. Morrison, how do you know the thermal expansion coefficient of alien stone? Same principles apply everywhere, Professor. Matter expands when heated, contracts when cooled. The trick is calculating the differential and compensating for it in your construction. Jake tapped a foundation stone with his knuckle, producing a clear, ringing tone. This one's good. Dense, stable, low porosity, perfect cornerstone. Within 2 hours, Jake had completed a foundation that looked like it had been built by a team of professional stonemasons with laser-guided equipment. It was perfectly level, properly drained, and obviously designed to support significant weight. Then he started on the walls, and this was where things got really impressive. Jake had cut his logs, or rather the local equivalent of logs, to exact specifications. Each piece was measured, notched, and fitted with joints that would have made medieval carpenters weep with envy. He wasn't just stacking wood, he was creating an interlocking system of perfectly fitted timbers that gained strength from every additional piece. How are you cutting such precise notches with a stone axe? Corin demanded, his own excavation project abandoned in favor of gaping at the human's work. Technique, Jake replied, carefully scoring a log with his axe before making the final cut. You make multiple shallow cuts along the grain, then remove the waste material in controlled sections. Takes longer than power tools, but the result is actually stronger because you're working with the wood's natural structure instead of against it. Each log was fitted with the precision of a Swiss chronometer. Jake would test fit each piece, make minute adjustments, then lock it into place with joints so tight they seemed to have grown that way naturally. The walls rose steadily, each course adding structural integrity to the whole. This is impossible, Zip muttered, his own nest-building project looking increasingly pathetic by comparison. No one builds like this without modern tools. Humans do, Jake said, hoisting another perfectly cut log into place. We've been doing precision joinery for thousands of years. Japanese carpenters can build entire temples without using a single nail, just perfect joints and understanding of wood stress patterns. But Jake wasn't finished. As the walls reached shoulder height, he began incorporating something that made Professor Vexter's academic mind simply shut down: a chimney. Not just a hole in the roof with some rocks around it, but an actual, engineered chimney with proper draft characteristics, smoke chamber, and flue design. Jake built it stone by stone, using a clay-like mud he'd discovered near the dried riverbed as mortar. Morrison, Professor Vexter said weakly, surely you don't intend to build an actual functional fireplace. Course I do. What's the point of shelter if you can't regulate temperature? Jake was now working on the smoke chamber, carefully angling each stone to create optimal airflow. Besides, this moon gets pretty cold at night. I checked the atmospheric data. Without proper heating, you'd be miserable. The fireplace took shape with the same methodical precision as everything else Jake built. Firebox, smoke chamber, damper system, and flue, all constructed from local materials but designed with principles that would have impressed professional masons. As the sun began to set, Jake was installing his roof. Not just laying branches across the walls, but creating an actual peaked roof structure with rafters, ridge beam, and what appeared to be a functional drainage system. He'd even woven a waterproof covering from processed plant fibers that looked like professional thatching. How do you know how to thatch? Corin asked, his voice hollow with defeat. Grandfather again, Jake replied, securing the final section of roofing. He believed in what he called complete self-sufficiency, said you never know when you might need to build shelter from scratch. The other students had long since abandoned their own projects to watch Jake work. Zip's nest looked like a bird had exploded. Corin's burrow was barely deep enough to hide in. The other alien students' various shelters ranged from marginally adequate to completely non-functional. Jake's cabin, meanwhile, was approaching completion with features that shouldn't have been possible: fitted door, functional windows made from carefully processed plant resin, and what appeared to be a primitive but effective ventilation system. This is insane, Professor Vextar whispered, making notes that no one would ever believe. You've built a functioning residence in less than 12 hours using nothing but stone tools and natural materials. Almost done, Jake said, putting the finishing touches on his door frame. Just need to install the interior features and get a fire going for the night. Interior features. The alien students exchanged glances of pure terror. What interior features? Zip asked in a voice that suggested he really didn't want to know. Jake's grin was now approaching levels that probably violated several galactic treaties. Oh, just basic amenities. Sleeping platform, storage areas, maybe a simple water collection system. The usual. Professor Vextar sat down heavily on a nearby rock, his tablet forgotten in his lap. His entire understanding of primitive survival had just been demolished by a human with a stone axe and an attitude. And Jake wasn't even finished yet. Dawn broke over Corvash 7 with the kind of crisp, clear light that makes everything look like it was photographed by a professional landscape artist. The alien students emerged from their various shelters looking like they'd spent the night wrestling with particularly vindictive furniture. Zip crawled out of what could charitably be called a nest but looked more like a pile of sticks that had gotten into a fight with each other. His fur was matted, his eyes were bloodshot, and he was making small whimpering sounds that suggested his species' natural nest-building instincts had betrayed him catastrophically. Corrand hauled himself out of his burrow, which had turned out to be more of a shallow depression with delusions of grandeur. His scales were caked with mud, his claws were chipped, and he looked like he'd discovered that evolution had played a cruel joke on his digging abilities. The other alien students presented various states of dishevelment, ranging from survived the night to seriously considering a career change. Then there was Jake's cabin. Professor Vextar approached the structure with the hesitant steps of someone walking toward their own execution. What he saw defied every preconception he'd ever held about primitive construction, human limitations, and the basic laws of what was possible with hand tools. The cabin stood before him like something that had been transported from a high-end architectural magazine. The log walls were perfectly straight, fitted with joints so precise they looked machined. The roof peaked at exactly the right angle for optimal snow load distribution and water runoff. The stone foundation was level enough to use as a surveyor's reference point, but it was the details that made Professor Vextar's academic mind simply refuse to process what he was seeing. The door was hung on hinges crafted from shaped stone and plant fiber, and it opened and closed with the smooth precision of a bank vault. The windows, actual functional windows, were glazed with a transparent material that Jake had somehow processed from local plant resins. They even had what appeared to be a primitive but functional opening mechanism. Smoke was curling from the chimney in a steady, controlled stream that spoke of proper draft design and optimal combustion efficiency. The whole structure radiated warmth, and there was a faint, pleasant aroma of wood smoke and something that smelled suspiciously like coffee. "Morrison," Professor Vextar called out, his voice cracking slightly. "Inspection time." The cabin door opened with a soft click, and Jake emerged looking like he'd spent the night in a luxury hotel. His hair was combed, his clothes were clean, and he was holding what appeared to be a steaming mug of something that definitely smelled like coffee. "Good morning, Professor," Jake said cheerfully. "Sleep well. I heard some interesting noises from the direction of the burrows around midnight." Corrand made a sound that was part growl, part whimper. "Morrison," Professor Vextar began, then stopped as the full implications of what he was seeing hit him. "Is that coffee?" "Close enough. Local plant extract, properly brewed and filtered. Turns out this moon has some interesting botanical specimens once you know what to look for." Jake took a sip and sighed contentedly. "Would you like some? I made extra." "You made extra coffee while building a cabin overnight on an alien moon using stone tools," Professor Vextar said slowly, as if testing each word for sanity. "Well, I had to test the fireplace efficiency anyway. Might as well make it useful." Jake gestured toward the cabin. "Would you like to see the interior? I'm pretty proud of the workmanship." Professor Vextar stepped through the doorway and immediately understood why his species had never conquered the galaxy. They'd been thinking too small. The interior of the cabin was a masterpiece of efficient design and practical engineering. The walls were chinked with perfectly applied clay mortar that sealed every gap. The floor was constructed from fitted stone slabs that had been ground smooth and level. A sleeping platform along one wall was raised for warmth and fitted with what appeared to be a mattress made from processed plant fibers. But it was the fireplace that made Professor Vextar question everything he thought he knew about primitive technology. The firebox was lined with heat-resistant stones, carefully selected and fitted to create optimal combustion conditions. The damper system was constructed from shaped stone and worked smoothly to control airflow. The smoke chamber was designed with proper proportions for draft efficiency, and the entire system was clearly engineered by someone who understood thermodynamics at a level that suggested advanced education. How? Professor Vextar whispered. How? What? Jake asked, adding another piece of wood to the fire with the casual expertise of someone who'd been doing this all his life. How did you build this? This isn't primitive construction. This is advanced engineering disguised as primitive construction. Jake looked around the cabin with the satisfied expression of a craftsman admiring his work. Professor, there's nothing primitive about human engineering. We've been solving complex structural problems for thousands of years. We just use different tools. But the precision, the design principles, the understanding of material properties, are all things humans figured out through trial and error over millennia of building shelters. Jake picked up a wooden cup from a shelf that definitely hadn't been there the night before. See, the thing about humans is we learn from our mistakes. Every collapsed roof, every failed foundation, every structure that couldn't handle the weather. We remember, we adapt, we improve. He filled the cup with coffee and handed it to Professor Vextar. We've been building in every environment on our planet. Arctic ice, desert sand, tropical swamps, mountain peaks. Each environment taught us something new about construction, about materials, about engineering principles. Professor Vextar took a sip of the coffee. It was perfect. But you built this in 12 hours. I built this in 12 hours, because I've been learning how to build for my entire life. My grandfather taught me, his grandfather taught him, and so on, back through generations of humans who understood that shelter isn't just about staying dry. It's about creating a space where you can live, not just survive. The other students had crowded around the doorway, staring into the cabin with the expressions of people witnessing a miracle. This is impossible, Zip said weakly. No, Jake replied, settling into a chair that he'd apparently also built during the night. This is human. Professor Vextar looked around the cabin one more time, taking in the expert craftsmanship, the efficient design, the comfortable amenities, and the casual way Jake had achieved what should have been impossible. Morrison, he said finally. What grade would you give this structure? Jake considered the question seriously. Honestly, it's a rush job. Give me a week and proper tools, and I could build you something really impressive. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Corin quietly crying into his claws. Professor Vextar stood in the middle of Jake's cabin, holding his cup of impossibly perfect coffee, and experienced what could only be described as an academic existential crisis. His forearms hung limply at his sides, his purple skin had shifted to a sickly green color, and his eyes were doing that thing where they blinked in completely random sequences, which usually happened when his brain was trying to process information that violated the fundamental laws of everything he thought he knew about the universe. Morrison, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, I need to understand something. When you say humans have been building shelters for thousands of years, you're not talking about crude huts and lean toes, are you? Jake, who was now working on what appeared to be a second cup of coffee from a brewing system he'd constructed from hollowed gourds and woven plant fibers, looked up with the expression of someone who'd been waiting for this question. Professor, humans built the pyramids 4,500 years ago. We constructed Roman aqueducts that are still functioning today. We've got wooden temples in Japan that have been standing for over 1,000 years without a single nail. We built stone cathedrals that took centuries to complete and are still considered engineering marvels. He gestured around the cabin with casual pride. This isn't advanced human engineering. This is basic human shelter construction. Boy Scout level stuff. Boy Scout level, Professor Vextar repeated numbly. Yeah, most human children learn basic carpentry and construction principles before they're teenagers. It's considered essential knowledge for survival preparedness. Jake took another sip of coffee. My grandfather always said a human who can't build their own shelter is a human who's forgotten what it means to be human. Zip, who had managed to squeeze his furry bulk through the doorway, was now examining the cabin's interior with the fascination of someone discovering that magic was real. Jake, how did you know the local materials would work for all of this? Pattern recognition and fundamental principles, Jake replied. Wood is wood, stone is stone, and physics works the same everywhere. The specific materials might be alien, but the engineering principles are universal. You just have to understand stress, load distribution, thermal dynamics, and material properties. Just understand, Corin said bitterly from the doorway. He says it like it's simple. It is simple, Jake said. genuinely confused by the aliens' distress. These are basic concepts. Any human with a decent education understands structural engineering fundamentals. We live in structures our entire lives. Professor Vextar set down his coffee cup and pulled out his tablet, his academic instincts finally overriding his shock. Morrison, I need to document this properly. Can you explain your construction process in detail? Sure. Jake stood up and moved to the fireplace, pointing out features as he explained. Foundation first. You survey for level, check drainage, then select stones for weight and stability. Each stone is positioned to distribute load evenly, while allowing for thermal expansion. The mortar is clay-based with organic binding agents for flexibility. He moved to the walls. Log construction uses interlocking joints for structural integrity. Each piece is cut to exact specifications using controlled fracture techniques with the stone axe. The joints are fitted so precisely that they actually get tighter as the wood seasons and contracts. Controlled fracture techniques. Professor Vextar was writing frantically. Basic toolmaking. Humans have been knapping stone for 2 million years. You learn to read the grain structure and apply force at precise angles to get the cuts you want. Jake picked up his stone axe and pointed to the blade. This edge is sharp enough to perform surgery with, if you know what you're doing. The professor's writing stylus snapped under the pressure of his grip. Jake continued his explanation, covering chimney design, roof structure, insulation principles, and ventilation systems. Each topic was presented with the casual expertise of someone who'd learned these skills as naturally as breathing. The key to the whole structure, Jake concluded, is understanding that everything works together. The foundation supports the walls support the roof protects the interior, and the fireplace provides climate control. It's a system, not just a pile of materials. A system, Professor Vextar repeated, his worldview continuing to crumble. Built in 12 hours, with stone tools, by a primitive human. Well, I wouldn't say primitive, Jake said diplomatically. Humans prefer to think of ourselves as elegantly practical. We might not have the fanciest technology, but we know how to get things done. The other students had formed a semicircle around Jake, looking at him with the kind of awe usually reserved for religious figures, or particularly impressive natural disasters. Jake, Zip said carefully, what would you consider advanced human construction? Jake's grin returned, approaching dangerous levels of smugness. Oh, you should see what we can do with proper tools and materials. Skyscrapers that reach into the clouds, tunnels that run under entire oceans, bridges that span distances your species would consider impossible, space stations that house thousands of people. He gestured toward the cabin. This is just basic survival shelter, human engineering at its most fundamental level. Professor Vextar looked around the cabin one more time, taking in the expert craftsmanship, the efficient design, the comfortable amenities, and the casual way Jake had redefined what was possible with primitive tools. Morrison, he said finally, what grade would you assign to this project? Jake considered the question with the seriousness of a master craftsman evaluating his work. Honestly, it's functional, but there's room for improvement. The window glazing could be clearer, the door hinges could be smoother, and I would have preferred to include a proper ventilation system for the sleeping area. He shrugged apologetically. Like I said, it's a rush job. Give me proper time and materials, and I could build you something that would make this look like a child's play fort. A child's play fort, Professor Vextar whispered. Yeah, human kids build tree houses more sophisticated than some of the structures I've seen from supposedly advanced species. Jake finished his coffee and set the cup down. No offense intended, of course. Professor Vextar pulled out his grading tablet with trembling hands. Next to Jake's name, he wrote a single word: outstanding. Then he added a note. Recommend immediate revision of all coursework related to human capabilities. Previous assessments appear to have been catastrophically inadequate. As the other students filed out of the cabin, chattering excitedly about human engineering and begging Jake for construction tutorials, Professor Vextar remained behind, staring at the walls with the expression of someone who'd just learned that everything they thought they knew about the universe was wrong. Morrison, he called out as Jake prepared to leave, one final question. When you said humans have been building for thousands of years, and this is basic level construction, what would you consider the pinnacle of human architectural achievement? Jake paused in the doorway, his expression thoughtful. Well, Professor, we've got this little project back home called the International Space Station. It's basically a city in space, built by multiple human nations working together, completely self-sustaining, designed to house humans permanently in an environment that would kill most species in seconds. He smiled, with the quiet pride of someone whose species had reached for the stars and grabbed them. We built it with the same principles I used here. Good engineering, quality materials, and the understanding that shelter isn't just about survival, it's about creating a place where life can flourish. Oh, Professor Vexstar said weakly. And one more thing. When you said this was Boy Scout level construction, what exactly is a Boy Scout? Jake's grin could have powered a small spacecraft. Human children, Professor. We teach our kids to build shelters like this for fun. And with that, Jake Morrison walked out of his expertly constructed cabin, leaving behind a professor whose understanding of primitive species had just been demolished as thoroughly as if he'd taken a stone axe to it. The greatest lesson of Corvash 7 wasn't about survival or construction, or even engineering. It was about the danger of underestimating a species that had spent 200,000 years learning to build homes in a universe that seemed determined to kill them. Humans, as it turned out, were very good at not dying, and even better at making sure they were comfortable while they did it.